Which New York Giants veterans have the most to lose this spring into the summer? I'll run down my list for you coming up next here on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI, which is where you can find all my written work. And as always, big welcome on in to my Blue Crew community members, my everydayers, my newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And happy Monday, everybody. We have kind of a quiet week coming up for us here on the Locked On Giants podcast as far as Giants activity, but we're going to kind of work with some analysis, some early analysis of where the Giants roster currently stands. So on today's show, what we're going to cover is a list that I have made of the toughest roster decisions that will affect certain players. I have about 6 players who I don't know what their long-term future is going to be with this team. I don't think it's going to be a long-term future. So we'll go through that, and I'll tell you why I think these guys are potentially bubble guys this early, even though we haven't really started the OTAs and certainly haven't started training camp. So we'll go through that. Then I want to turn to, in segment 2, I want to talk a little bit about the question of should the Giants trade Jameis Winston to the New Orleans Saints if they have an opportunity. And I'll give you my 2 cents on that. And then we'll just wrap things up with a fact or fiction edition, which basically the question is going to be, do the Giants really need to add another wide receiver to their group that they're running it back with? You know, the trio of Malik Neighbors, Darius Slayton, and Wan'Dale Robinson. So I'll give you my thoughts on that as well. All right, we've got a lot to get through. So let's start with the toughest roster decisions. Now, I have 6 guys I put on this list of mine. Some of these decisions I think are no-brainers. Some of them might be a little tricky, but these are the guys that I think are, shall we say, not standing on solid ground as far as their roster spot is concerned. And I'm going to start off with tight end Daniel Bellinger. Now, Bellinger 2 years ago, 689 snaps, that dropped to 364 last year. Now, what's interesting there with Bellinger, who I believe was a 4th-round pick 3 years ago, he initially, you thought he was going to be tight end 1. But then the following year, the Giants traded for Darren Waller. That didn't work out. Then they drafted again. They drafted Theo Johnson, who seems to have passed Bellinger on the depth chart. And Bellinger, if you look at his past targets, he went from 38 as a rookie to 28 in his second year to 14 last year. So he's kind of been phased out a little bit of that passing game. And I think a big reason for that is, maybe a lack of athleticism. Bellinger last year averaged 5.0 yards after the catch. Not a big yak guy. So, you want your tight end to be able to shake off some of these defenders, be able to pick up some of the yards after the catch, especially if you're sending them up the seam and whatnot. And Bellinger really not that good at doing that, or at least from what we've seen the last couple of years. Now, another thing that I think hurt Bellinger, Chris Manhertz. Chris Manhertz came in, kind of became the blocking tight end that I think the team was hoping Bellinger would become. The Giants brought Chris Manhertz back. And, of course, they drafted Thomas Fidone II, who I think is going to develop into the next version of Chris Manhertz. So, yeah, Bellinger is going into his 4th and final year of his rookie deal. I don't think he's going to be back after this coming year, if he even makes it out of camp. So that's something to keep an eye on. Shame, too, because he's a good guy, works his tail off, but the handwriting's on the wall. They've been drafting over him or acquiring guys ahead of him. Kind of tells you all you need to know about what they kind of think with his prospects. All right. Another guy that I just don't know what's going on with him, Jaylen Hyatt. When we talk about the Giants receivers, and I'm going to talk about that in segment 3 a little bit more, But Jaylen Hyatt has seen his snap count drop dramatically. He had 557 snaps on offense in his first year, 334 snaps last year. He just basically, was thrown a bone here and there. And I don't know if it's because of the playbook. I don't know if it's because, of the quarterback play. I'm not sure what exactly it is. But Jaylen Hyatt, you look at the Giants receivers and, you see them trying talking to Gabe Davis. You see them bringing in Zach Pascal and some of these other big bodied receivers. And again, it's a case of the Giants just bringing in guys with the thought of potentially putting them ahead of their third round draft pick that they traded up to get, no less. So Jaylen Hyatt, I think, is definitely somebody, who might be on the bubble very early on at any rate. Now, this is somebody who I know was mentioned earlier in the year, and the Giants didn't do anything with him, but Graham Gano. Now, I do think Gano will stay on the roster. He will stick on the roster. But here's the thing with Gano. He's got the third highest cap hit this year of all the kickers. But the last 2 years, he has converted 70.5% of his field goal attempts of 40 or more yards. Gano, I used to call him Mr. Automatic. Can't call him that anymore because it just hasn't been the case. And I know he's had the injuries, but he just, something's dropped off with him. And not just with the field goals, but the kickoffs as well. All right. He had last year a career low 24 touchbacks. And I know he missed time because of, an injury, but still it was significantly lower than what he had averaged, in the past. The opponents, now this part is really not so much totally Gano's fault as it is his coverage unit, but the average starting field position for Giants opponents after a kickoff was 29.2 yards. Okay, so opponents were starting near the 30-yard line on kickoff returns. That was the highest average starting field position for Gano since he joined the team in 2020. So, I think they stick with him this year, but these numbers are surely, trending in the wrong direction. And I just wonder if it's just a matter of time before the Giants say, hey, maybe we should bring somebody in to compete with this guy because his performance is starting to drop off a little bit here. All right, next guy I have, Eric Gray, running back. Now, it's interesting. A lot of analysis that I've seen say that Devin Singletary is probably the guy that has to, watch out for his roster spot, given the addition of Cam Scatterboo. I don't think the Giants move on from Devin Singletary. He's got guaranteed money owed to him this year, number one, and he's a pretty good pass blocker. All right. Eric Gray, in the meantime, he has had, 31 rushing attempts in 2 seasons. He's played just 50 snaps on offense. He's averaged 2.5 yards per attempt, 1.77 yards post contact. His pass pro has been the worst of the running backs. And, even on special teams when he was the kickoff returner, I think he's lost that job to Emir Smith-Marset. So I think the Giants will keep Singletary, who, like I said, is a good pass protector, at least until Cam Scatterboo shows he could do it. But I think this would probably be Singletary's last year with the Giants. Even though he's got another year on his contract, this is the last year of his guaranteed money. I think he goes after that. Eric Gray, I'm not sure they keep him, if I'm being honest with you. Okay. Rakeem Nunez-Roches, another guy. Rakeem Nunez-Roches last year played in 147 more snaps than he did the year prior. And his numbers just, they were pedestrian. So, you look at the addition of Darius Alexander. Darius Alexander has better position flexibility than Nacho does. So if Dexter Lawrence has to come off the field for a little bit, for a breather, Darius Alexander, based on, his background, should be able to step in there and hopefully there won't be that much of a drop off. But Nacho has kind of been, dare I say, invisible in the run stop game, which is supposed to be his strength. So I do think the Giants will move on from him. I'm quite honestly, I'm surprised he wasn't a cap hit, or a cap cut, I should say, earlier in the year. But I guess they want to give him an opportunity to, you know, to be a part of the rotation. But they did bring in not only Alexander, but they brought in some other defensive linemen to deepen that rotation. And there's just no way they're going to be able to keep all these guys. Nacho is a guy that I think is in trouble with his roster spot. And then finally, this is kind of obvious, but Tommy DeVito. I think, DeVito's run has ended with this team. Um, the Giants aren't going to keep four quarterbacks. And even if they said, okay, we want to keep DeVito on the practice squad, I don't know necessarily that he's going to make the practice squad. What I could see happening with DeVito, if he gets cut, as I think he will, maybe the New Orleans Saints put in a claim for him. Okay. And if they do, because the New Orleans Saints, they've got a quarterback lineup there that hasn't, that I think each guy has fewer than 2 years experience and not a whole lot of starting experience. So DeVito hitting the waiver wire, I think, New Orleans might be a team to keep an eye on that if that happens. So yeah, DeVito is, I don't see him being cut by the Giants and then making their practice squad. I could see the Saints maybe potentially jumping on DeVito if he becomes available after, training camp cuts are made. All right, coming up next, speaking of quarterbacks, the question came up a little while ago, should the Giants look to trade Jameis Winston to the Saints, who, like I said, need quarterback help? I'm going to tell you my answer, and I'm going to tell you why. That's coming up right after this. Hey, Giant fans, say goodbye to sticky notes, scribbled plans on the fridge, and overlapping calendar invites. The Skylight calendar is here to bring clarity to the chaos and help families stay organized without the stress. The sleek digital display syncs with your existing calendars, Google, Apple, Outlook, and more, making it simple to track appointments, practices, dinners, and reminders all in one easy to see place. Look, in my line of work, things frequently pop up on my calendar, and quite often things change due to breaking news and other factors that are common in my job. And ever since I got my Skylight calendar, which by the way, I absolutely love, we've put it in a central location in my house because I can update it now on the fly and have it available so that everybody is on the same page. My husband always knows now, when I have a meeting, when I'm going to be running late, when I have to run to the Giants, whatever the case may be. So if you're looking to bring some organization to your household's busy schedules, give Skylight a try. And right now, Skylight is offering our listeners $30 off their 15-inch calendars when you go to skylightcal.com/NFL. That's SKYLIGHTCAL.com/NFL to get $30 off your 15-inch calendar. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And again, this week's kind of a quiet week. The Giants are finishing up phase 2 of the offseason program. Next week, after Memorial Day, phase 3, or the OTAs, start. We will have media access on Wednesday, not this Wednesday, the following Wednesday. I'll be there. I'll have a report for you, interviews, all that good stuff. So make sure you keep it here. We are still 5 days a week here on the Locked On Giants podcast, and we appreciate you spending part of your day with us here on Locked On Giants. All right, let's talk about a question that popped up when Derek Carr of the New Orleans Saints announced his retirement. And right away, people were like, oh, maybe the Saints and the Giants should try to work out an offer for, or a trade, I should say, for Jameis Winston. Because look, we all know that eventually Jackson Dart is going to be the starter. Russell Wilson is only here on 1 year. So why not see if you can't move, Jameis Winston, who played for the Saints, albeit under a different coaching staff, see if you can't move him back to New Orleans. Folks, I don't see that happening for several reasons. I mentioned at the end of last segment that maybe the Saints, if they're not satisfied with where their quarterbacks are at the end of training camp, maybe they see if Tommy DeVito gets cut, or maybe they see if somebody from Cleveland gets cut, because Cleveland has an abundance of quarterbacks. So right now, I think the feeling down in New Orleans is they're going to kind of roll with what they have and see if maybe, Tyler Shuck, who they took in the draft, maybe he's ready to go. maybe Spencer Rattler is going to be ready to go, whatever the case may be. But I don't think the Giants should trade Winston. And the reason I say that, you're going to have, like I said, you've got Russell Wilson starting this year for the Giants. Winston is going to be quarterback 2. When it's all said and done, Dart will be quarterback 3. Dart will be acclimating this year. He will spend most of his time as the emergency quarterback, which means he will probably only play if something happens to Wilson and Winston. Now, besides the fact that Winston can mentor Dart, as can Wilson, by the way, the reason, if you look at the contracts and the length of the contracts, Wilson was signed to 1 year, which means after this year, the hope is that Dart will be ready to be the starter. Winston was signed to 2 years at backup money with an option for it to, extend to starter money if he is pressed into action. So the plan there, as evidenced by the contracts and how they're set up, Wilson this year, next year, hopefully Dart is ready. Then Winston is his backup. Winston can continue to mentor Dart because, look, he's going to mentor him now as well as Wilson. Wilson will mentor Dart right now, but the mentoring is going to continue once Dart gets on the field. And that's where it's really going to ramp up a little bit. So having Winston on the roster this year and next year, I think is a valuable thing for the Giants to do. Plus, like I said, if something were to happen and Dart, for whatever reason, wasn't ready or if he was injured, you got a guy in Winston who can step in there and, maybe win you a couple games here and there if you need him to. So just based on all that, I don't think, the Giants are going to want to move Winston. All right. Now, if they got a really sweet offer, like, a day 2 pick, you'd think about it. But I don't think they would get that. I think at the best, maybe they would get like a 6th or 7th round offer, from the Saints. I don't think that's enough to move Winston. And like I said, I think he has a little bit more value than what people are maybe giving him credit for because of the Jackson Dart, situation. And, one of the things I'm kind of interested in seeing, especially as we get into summer training camp, is just how Jameis Winston is going about mentoring Jackson Dart. And that's something that, I'm going to want to ask not just Dart, but also Winston if I get that opportunity. Right now, Brian Dable made a point. He said, look, Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston are still trying to learn the playbook. And the Giants playbook, as I have said many times before, it's a complicated offense. All right. Even for a veteran quarterback, it's a complicated offense that you have to kind of really, dig into because one word can dictate what 50, what 11 guys are going to do. So, they have to kind of learn all that. But yeah, Winston, I think he's here next year as quarterback 2 and as that, I don't want to say crutch, but as that cushion, if you will, that safety net for Jackson Dart. Because, if Dart sits this entire year, okay, he's going to acclimate, great. But until he actually gets out on the field and starts doing it, that's when you're going to know where he is in his development. You've got mental reps will only take you so far. And once Dart gets an opportunity to get out on the field, to start throwing the ball around, to start reading coverages and setting protections and all that good stuff, that's when you're going to know if Dart has really come along. And, again, Winston will be on the radio. Dart will be on the radio. They'll hear the calls being made to Wilson this year. Maybe the two of them will talk about it. I expect to see Winston and Dart side by side on the sidelines this year a lot. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic, I think, to watch. And of course, we will see how it all plays out. Because like I said, I think when training camp is all said and done, Dart will be quarterback 3. He won't be quarterback 3 for long, but probably for most of the season, I would think. So, all right, coming up next, we have a fact or fiction question. Do the Giants need another receiver? And if they do, why? And if they don't, why not? I'll tell you right after this. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And we're going to close out today's show with a fact or fiction question. Should the Giants, or do the Giants, I should say, need another wide receiver? Fact. Absolutely fact. All right, now you're saying, okay, but they re-signed Darius Slayton to be wide receiver 2. They have Malik Neighbors. They've got Wan'Dale Robinson. Why do they need another receiver, especially when they've gone and they've added all these other guys, in the offseason? They added Zach Pascal, like I mentioned, and a few other guys, Lil Jordan Humphrey, they've added, some taller guys. So why another receiver, especially when they have Jaylen Hyatt? Well, as I mentioned in segment 1, I think Jaylen Hyatt, just it's not working out here for him for whatever the reason. And by the way, I am going to try and get to the bottom of it. I promise you, it won't be right away, but I will, see if I can figure out what's going on with Jaylen Hyatt. But here's why I think the Giants need another wide receiver, and it has to do with Wan'Dale Robinson. Now, Wan'Dale Robinson last year, out of 44 receivers who had at least 85 targets, he averaged 7.5 yards per reception, which was dead last in that 44 receiver sample group. All right, so that's item number 1. And Robinson had 132 targets last year. Way too many, in my opinion, for, the production that they were getting out of him. I think ideally what they would like to do is get Malik Neighbors in the slot a little bit more. Last year, according to Pro Football Focus, Malik Neighbors was in the slot 27.1% of his snaps. And oh, by the way, Malik Neighbors was actually a little bit better in the slot. All right. So if you move him into the slot, now who's your outside guy? You have Slayton on one side. Who's your outside guy if it's not going to be Jaylen Hyatt? Or if it's not going to be Zach Pascal? Or if it's not going to be Lil Jordan Humphrey? Or if it's not going to be, you name it, you plug in whatever receiver. That's, folks, is why the Giants probably want to look for another receiver. And, they kicked the tires on Gabe Davis. I didn't think they were going to sign him when they brought him in last week because Gabe Davis, he's still recovering from I think it was a meniscus injury in his knee, for which he had season-ending surgery. So I think it was just a kind of a check-in type of deal. Now, could I see the Giants signing Gabe Davis later on in the spring, or maybe early summer, or maybe even to training camp? Yes, I could definitely see that. And I think if you bring in Gabe Davis, now you have another outside receiver who you put on one side. You have Darius Slayton on the other. And then if you want to put Malik Neighbors into the slot, I think you've just now given yourself a little bit more firepower on that unit. All right. Never mind the fact now that Wan'Dale Robinson is going into the final year of his contract. It's not that, I don't want to see him back. I just felt like, for as much as they leaned on him last year, the return just wasn't good enough. And I think the Giants realized that as well. Now, we all know they didn't draft a receiver this year. And the reason for that, obviously, is because when they traded up to get Jackson Dart, they lost some draft picks. So that's why I think it's probably not, a bad idea for them to keep their eyes open for a veteran wide receiver. And if Gabe Davis can be that guy, then great. He's a guy who knows that Dable offense. He's a guy who can, like I said, line up on the outside and give them a little bit more flexibility. And I think it would just, if they could get a receiver like that, healthy, of course, it'll just make such a big difference for their offense. So, yeah, absolutely. I think the Giants should look for another receiver, especially, again, if they're not going to get, Jaylen Hyatt into the mix. Wan'Dale Robinson will still have a role on this team. You can't just totally say, okay, if they bring in a Gabe Davis, for example, you can't just automatically say, oh, now we're going to play Malik Neighbors in the slot all the time. I don't think you could do that. But I do think there is definitely a world where Malik Neighbors plays more than 27.1% of his snaps in the slot. Maybe up that to, I don't know, about 35, 36%. Just to get a little bit more variety. Because like I said, when Neighbors worked out of the slot, he was a little bit more effective there. And, it just gave the Giants a little bit more in terms of options. Now, maybe the quarterback play will will fix what ails Wan'Dale Robinson. I'm not sure it will. But or maybe you can make the argument, was his knee still bothering him, the one that he ripped up? I don't think that was the case. Although they say it could take up to 2 years before a guy fully is himself. But look, you try and you play your players at the positions of strength for them. And Malik Neighbors is good on the outside, don't get me wrong. But if he's just as good on the inside, wouldn't you want to get him on the inside in certain circumstances, take advantage of his skill set, and win some of those matchups? I think it just makes too much sense. So that's why I could see them potentially adding to the receiver group. And I know they have like a dozen. They always bring in a dozen every year, anyhow, for training camp. And who knows? Maybe the guy that they want is already on the roster. But the fact that they did a check-in with Gabe Davis tells me that maybe that guy isn't on the roster, and maybe they're hoping to have a reunion. They being Joe Shane and Brian Dable. Shane, who scouted Gabe Davis when he was in Buffalo, and Dable, who of course had Davis on the Bills team when he was the offensive coordinator. Maybe they're helping for a reunion once Davis's knee checks out and he can pass a physical. So that being said, that's going to do it for this edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you keep it here all week long. We're still 5 days a week. We still got a lot more football to cover. And we will bring it to you here on the Locked On Giants podcast. So until tomorrow, everybody, we will see you and have a good day.